Alright guys, we are back talking about nationalism and unification, and in our last video we looked at Eastern Europe, where the Austrian Empire was and where the Ottoman Empire was, and we looked at the role nationalism played in weakening those two countries and causing division. Today we're gonna go a little further east into the biggest country in Europe, in fact the biggest country in the world, and that is Russia. And we're going to see how nationalism and other factors are causing some unrest and some movements to reform modernization in Russia. So let's get into the topic. And this is a pretty big topic, guys. We're going to go through quite a bit of history in this section. So try to keep up, I guess is what I'm going to say. All right, so let's look at Russia. Now, Russia, as we know, is the biggest country in the world, and if you look at it, the reason for that is over time it's expanded largely to the east, not as much to the west, because it's much tougher to, because these areas out here are much more populated. It's harder for the Russian military to just break through over here, but over here it's pretty empty, and so it's easier for Russia to expand. But you can kind of get a lay of the land here. I mean, Russia was an absolutely mammoth country. It still is, even though it's not as large as it was on this map. All right, well, let's get into the political structure and the economic structure of Russia. So if you looked at Europe, the rest of Europe at this time, by the mid-1800s, we're looking at a country or a continent rather, that's starting to develop economically. It's becoming a little bit more politically free. There are still lots of monarchies, but they're not absolute monarchies really in most countries any longer. That is not the case in Russia. Russia is still, compared to the rest of Europe, backward, both socially, economically, and politically. It was poorer, it was less free. The picture really sums it up, right? If you're in Britain or something, you're using a steamboat or a train or something, you're not using humans to pull a boat, right? I mean, this is kind of visually what Russia was this time, just kind of backwards. Now, at the top of Russian society was an emperor, an absolute ruler, and he was called a czar. And czar is a play off of the word Kaiser. Kaiser and czar are a play off the word Caesar, which is a throwback to, of course, Julius Caesar and ancient Rome. And so he's the emperor or Caesar of Russia. This guy was the czar. And underneath the czar was a population of millions, probably over 100 million at this time. And about a third of those were poor serfs. Now, serfs are a special category of peasants. Serfs are at the very bottom of Russian society. They're not technically slaves in the sense that they're not bought and sold like, say, slavery in other parts of the world. But these people had virtually no rights. They owed labor to a landlord. They couldn't leave their home without permission. They couldn't even get married without permission of the landlord. So it's not exactly slavery, but it's about as close as you can possibly get. And again, a third of the entire country is in this situation, and they're gripped by serfdom. So if you've got about a third of Russians with pretty much no rights at all, that could create some problems, right? I mean, that could create resentment, hatred, and even revolution. And this brings us to our first big Russian leader of today, Alexander II. And he's remembered for doing something called emancipation. And this is a word we know from American history because emancipation refers to freedom. To free somebody is to emancipate them. And who he's freeing are the serfs. So in 1861, which is, ironically enough, right during our Civil War as well, the Russian Tsar, Alexander II, emancipates or frees the serfs. Now, he's doing this for a couple of reasons. He's come to the realization that Russia is simply going to be held backwards by serfdom if they don't get rid of it. Like, they're never going to truly develop politically, socially, and economically as long as serfdom is around. Secondly, he's also fearful of the potential for revolution with the serfs, famously saying it's better to liberate, that means to free, it's better to liberate the peasants from above than from below. In other words, it's better to give the serfs their freedom than for the serfs to take their freedom and in the process destroy the country. Nonetheless, Alexander II is later assassinated. 20 years later, after emancipating the serfs, he is assassinated. And his assassination really does speak to the instability and unhappiness there was in Russia even after the emancipation of the serfs. There wasn't a lot of political freedom in Russia, and a group calling themselves the People's Will literally blew up the Tsar. Now, he was the survivor of several other assassination attempts, but they finally got him in March of 1881. Now, his son, who we're going to talk about in a moment, had this church built on the site of his father's murder. It's called the Church of the Savior on Spilled Blood. The spilled blood, a reference to his father's murder. And I got to say, that's a pretty impressive church. So there is the son, Alexander III. So think about this guy. He's the new Tsar of Russia. His father had been murdered by revolutionaries. And his father had also granted freedoms to Russians, and he was still blown up. So how eager is this guy going to be to continue his father's reforms? And the answer, of course, is not at all. And so what we see in Alexander III is a swing back the other direction. If his father was a guy who stood for granting more freedom and kind of a hope for a freer future, Alexander III is in the complete opposite direction. He was a guy who was absolutely ruthless and aggressive against his critics. His father's reforms are halted, many of them undone, and he is aggressively trying to reassert royal power in Russia, trying to overawe anyone who might stand in the way of the Russian monarchy. And in fact, if you look at this painting of Alexander III, we see something about his rule that really kind of harkens back to something we studied at the very beginning of the year, this idea of divine right, this idea that God had given him the right to rule over Russia, right? You've got the saints and angels behind him, sort of implying that he has God's a little check mark, you're mine, you're ruling Russia because I want you to rule Russia. Now, if you were a member of Russian society who didn't like Alexander III and tried to do something to resist his rule or weaken him in some way, chances are you're going to find yourself sent off to these huge prison camps that were being constructed in Siberia. Now, Siberia is the Asian part of Russia. So think Eastern Russia, where it's remote, it's largely empty, it's just, thousands of miles of empty wilderness. It gets incredibly cold in the wintertime there. So it's frankly a good place to put people you don't like. And so Alexander III is shipping a lot of Russians off to Siberia. Now, when we say Russia, it's tempting to think everyone in Russia is Russian, but that's not the case at all. There are lots of different ethnic groups inside Russia. You've got Georgians and Ukrainians and Belarusians and Lithuanians, Estonians, Latvians, Armenians. I mean, I could keep going, but I'm not going to because there's so many of them. So Russians, the red guys on this map, they rule over this empire. And this is very similar to the phenomenon we saw with the Austrian Empire or the Ottoman Empire. We have one group ruling over a bunch of other groups. And of course, that means these groups are probably going to be feeling nationalism, right? They're going to feel this sort of desire to break away and rule their own affairs. So having said all that, is Alexander III a guy who's going to embrace ethnic and religious diversity, or is he going to fear religious and ethnic diversity? And of course, he's going to fear it. His attempt to kind of suppress non-Russian cultures is called Russification. So Russification was this idea that basically, whether you're ethnically Russian or not, you are going to be Russian, right? You're going to speak Russian. You're going to worship Russian Orthodox religion. You're going to just basically blend in. He doesn't like the idea of individual groups kind of being independent. He doesn't trust that. That's scary for him. He wants everyone to be the same. And he doesn't trust you if you don't speak his language or worship his God in his way. Again, Russification, trying to wipe out any non-Russian cultures in Russia. In particular, one group really drew his ire, and that is the Jewish population of Russia. So there was a very large Jewish population in Western Russia, basically where Russia meets the rest of Europe. Some of this is modern-day Poland and Ukraine and areas like that. This is where a lot of Jews lived, and Alexander III really put a lot of limits on Jewish life, forcing them to live in certain villages, restricting them from certain occupations, really cutting down on their civil rights. Furthermore, he basically allowed, in some ways, even incited these mob attacks on Jews in Russia. These attacks are called pogroms, and a pogrom, again, is just this like sort of anarchic, wild mob attack on Jews, where they are being just, Jewish villages stormed and property destroyed, and the government basically either standing aside and letting it happen, or actually participating in allowing this to happen. And so this is, this is evidence of anti-Semitism in Russia. All right, now, after Alexander III passes, we're on to our third and final Russian monarch of our lesson today. In fact, he's going to be the last monarch Russia will ever have. His name is Nicholas II. And I want you to look at this painting of him on the left, and it frankly looks different from a lot of royal portraits we've seen this year. He looks a lot humbler. He looks a lot just kind of plain. He's not sitting on a throne. He doesn't have a big gaudy crown on his head. He's not surrounded by jewels and riches. He just looks kind of plain. So let's look at how Nicholas II ruled Russia and see how things are changing. So Nicholas II takes over in 1894 when his father, Alexander III, died. And he is going to rule during this time period of rapid industrialization and rapid modernization in Russia. So Russia is starting to catch up with the rest of Europe. They're building railroads, factories, steel mills, mines. Electricity is starting to be, wired in big cities. I mean, this is it's a new Russia, really, under Nicholas II. Now, with industrialization, of course, comes all those other things like urbanization and pollution, and workers, going on strike for better rights and better working conditions and so forth. But even having said all that, life was pretty difficult in industrial Russia. It was the Industrial Revolution was rough all across the world, but especially in Russia, just because Russia is always a little bit kind of behind in these social reforms. Now, as evidence of this modernization of Russia, we can point to one of the greatest infrastructure projects ever in history. It's called the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And the goal of this railroad was to connect the eastern and western portions of Russia. So it would go from the capital city of St. Petersburg all the way across Russia to the port city of Vladivostok. And this may, on a map it looks kind of small, like, it's just a little line, who cares? But this is an incredible undertaking, guys. We're talking a railroad that's almost 6,000 miles long. I mean, America is basically, if you go from California to, say, like New York or something, you're talking a distance of maybe 2,500 miles. This is 5,700 miles long. I mean, that's impressive, especially when they had to build it across Siberia, which was basically empty. In fact, you see all these cities right here. They weren't there before the Siberian Railway. They are basically they are created because of the railroad. So you're building this railroad out into some of the greatest wilderness, most remote wilderness in all of planet Earth. Now, as Russia expands ever further east, there's a particular country out here in Asia who's feeling very nervous about that. And it's not China like you would expect. I mean, China was nervous, but China was also a weak, frankly, dysfunctional country this time. They really couldn't stand up to Russia anyways. Instead, who's getting really nervous is this up-and-coming industrialized country called Japan. And this leads us to something called the Russo-Japanese War. And this Russo-Japanese War saw Russia and Japan clash over who would control areas such as Manchuria and the Korean Peninsula. And everyone expected Russia to win this because Russia is the biggest country in the world. And a lot of Europeans looked down on Japan as frankly kind of inferior, like you can't possibly defeat a European power or Japan. What are you thinking? But Japan does. They shock the world. They humiliate Russia. You can see Nicholas II here. He's not looking so good. Things are not looking good at all. And by the way, if you're wondering why Teddy Roosevelt is up here, the reason is he's going to help negotiate an end to this war. It's called the Treaty of Portsmouth. And for that reason, he's going to win a Nobel Peace Prize. Pax is Latin for peace. And of course, he looks kind of like a dove here. He's holding an olive branch. So he's going to help end this war. Now, I want to show you just one quick example of Russia's defeat in this war. It wasn't just on land that they were defeated. They were also defeated at sea. So the Russian fleet had to sail from over here in the Baltic Sea all the way over here to Japan, which is a distance of, you're literally going around the world. This is about a long, long voyage. It takes months to get over there, and then when they get there, they're defeated, and not like close defeated, but like a resounding defeat. You can see 21 ships sunk, 6,000 sailors captured, almost 4,400 sailors dead. Russia was humiliated. And so you've got a country in Russia that's divided, it's unhappy, it's now been humiliated by Japan, and what happens next is, frankly, predictable. Revolution. Now, every revolution kind of has like a spark, like a moment where it's like, okay, it's revolution time. And in this case, it's something called Bloody Sunday. So what happened was, on January 22nd, 1905, thousands of unarmed, peaceful protesters gathered outside the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. And they were there to ask the Tsar for reforms. They were there to ask the Tsar to, fix the corruption in the government, give people more rights. They're unhappy about the losses in the Russo-Japanese War. What they don't realize is that the Tsar is not home. But guards are, and these guards, the palace guards, open fire on the protesters. And the death toll is unknown. Some people say maybe 200 people were killed. Some people say 1,000 people were killed. But the point is, the army is basically just opening fire on unarmed civilians. And this is the moment where a lot of people in Russia just totally lose their faith in the Tsar. They had felt that the Tsar was kind of above all this mess, and he was looking out for them. They saw him as their father, metaphorically. And this is it. They hate him now. And that leads to what's known as the Revolution of 1905. And the Revolution of 1905 is a combination of worker strikes, mutinies in the military, rebels rising up. It's a mess. And it looks like for a time that, in fact, the Russian monarchy might be overthrown in this revolution. But in the end, the revolution begins to kind of unravel, and Nicholas II survives. And one of the reasons he survives is he agrees to create a legislature called the Duma. And in theory, this would act as almost kind of like the parliament in Britain, where you would have a group of representatives who can advise the king and even provide some sort of check to his power. But that's not what this is going to be. It was weak. It was built to be weak to begin with. And after a short time, once everything starts to calm down, Nicholas basically dissolves the Duma, and it's back to normal. So the revolution of 1905, the Russians learned a lesson that, we didn't succeed this time, but the next time we will. And when we do it, we're going to make sure we don't stop until the monarchy is destroyed. And that is what's going to happen in 1917 during World War I. But that is something we'll get to later. So we've covered a lot of ground, guys. I know I threw a lot of information at you. Couple quick key points to remember. We had 3 rulers we covered. For Alexander II, think about his emancipation of the serfs, and then think about his assassination and that effect on then Alexander III, his successor. Alexander III was a repressive leader who wanted to strengthen the monarchy and weaken any opposition to the monarchy. And then his son, Nicholas II, oversaw a modernizing Russia that found itself in a war against Japan, a war they couldn't win, and that led then to Bloody Sunday and the Revolution 1905 and a great weakening of the Russian monarchy. All right, guys, that was a lot of information I know, but we are done with Russia, and we're going to move on in our next video we're going to head back to Western Europe.